All right. Welcome, everybody. This is our Monday evening Q&A and our once monthly conversation between Nisabho and myself, Ajahn Kovilo.
Ajahn, Namaste Khan, it's good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Our conversation for this evening will be around the topic of wonder or wonderment in Buddhism, and we'll look at it from different angles. So yeah, and people can feel free to put questions into either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll answer the questions as they come.
First of all, Ajahn, where are you? Just fill us in.
Yeah, right now I'm at Empty Cloud Monastery in West Orange, New Jersey. I've been here for about 3 weeks now with Bhante Sudaso and Ayasoma. I've been received very, very well. It's a nice community in a very large old Christian monastery. And yeah, it's great. There's a very diverse group of people who support the monastery, and it's still somewhat COVID quarantined. So there aren't very many people, but that is good in the sense that it gives us a bit more quiet to the monastery. So that's me. And you? Tell us where you are.
I just arrived in Seattle, so I'm actually in the basement of my aunt's house right now. So I'm like by an old bike and a treadmill and a lamp. But it's a transition period. I just came from, and it's actually pretty luxurious because for the last month I've been living in a tent in central Washington on my parents' property in the Cascade Hermitage, where they're trying to kind of build 2 monastic kutis. So I was there sort of helping them out for the last month, and we just finished our first end of month retreat, which is a lot of fun. And and so now I just arrived in Seattle, and this is where the project, which Ajahn Kovilo and I are going to be spearheading, will take root, hopefully, Clear Mountain Monastery. So tomorrow I go to the first sort of kuti where we're staying on Southworth in Seattle. So I'm looking forward to that.
All right. This is historic.
Indeed it is. My aunt's basement, the historic beginnings. But I was glad, Ajahn Kovilo and I really we lived at the Pacific Hermitage together for the winter, and also walked Tudong together, sort of pilgrimage a few years back. And we had a lot of good discussions on Dhamma and different ways of looking at it. So we decided that this sort of conversation format every now and again would be a beautiful way of kind of actually getting to talk with each other when we're not right by each other. And hopefully others would find it interesting as well. So I think, Ajahn, you came up with the topic today, which was a great one. Do you want to go into it at first and share some of your thoughts on wonder in Buddhism?
Sure. Yeah, for me, when I'm trying to understand a concept in English, I try to figure out what would be possible Pali translations for that word, and then to look up different contexts for where that word comes up in the Pali Canon. So with this word wonder, I first came across it most recently about 2 months ago. I was invited to attend a secular Buddhist retreat. It was a 2-day weekend retreat led by Stephen Batchelor, and I really enjoyed it for the most part. There were a couple of statements which I just wasn't quite sure how to process. And one of those was that there's no place in historic Buddhism or in Theravada Buddhism, the Pali Canon, that there's no place for wonder. Wonder is something which is a Western addition and Western concept which is lacking in Buddhism, and Buddha shouldn't try to pretend like it exists there. So that was something to think about, and it started me thinking, oh, is that true or is it not true, and to what extent is it true? So that was why I thought it would be good to talk about. And in doing a bit of research for this talk, looking up what some possible translations for wonder would be in Pali, and the easiest word would be acharya or abhuta. So this is a word which Bhikkhu Bodhi and others translates as wonderful and marvelous, acharya abhuta, and it comes up all over the place, hundreds of times, if not over 1,000 times, in the Vinaya Pitaka and the Sutta Pitaka, as just something either said by the Buddha or by his disciples, as just an exclamation for something that's amazing. So one of the Buddha's disciples, say Mahamoggallana, would see some ghostly being and no one else would see it. And Mahamoggallana would say, Acharya, Abhuta, it's amazing, it's marvelous that such beings exist. And the Buddha would use it really in more mundane contexts as well, like it's wonderful, it's marvelous how paticca samuppada manifests in the world, or how dependent origination arises in the world. So it's in general just an exclamation, and it appears largely in a doctrinal kindness context, but it also appears in a number of discourses talking about the ocean. So I think we'll get into how the word wonder appears in modern humanist and New Age movements in relation to our relationship with nature. But there are all these similes for how the ocean is wonderful and marvelous, in that it has all sorts of gems and coral and huge animals in it, and it's got these 8 different qualities. And similarly, the Dhamma Vinaya is wonderful and marvelous for these other reasons. So that's just a general introduction. Any thoughts from your end, either about Acharya Abhuta or from a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good topic, and it's helpful to hear you contextualize it. When I was contemplating it, I think, first just some brief thoughts that, I think that word of wonder for me, it automatically harkens back to the Romantic poets and sort of really romanticizing moments in nature where the self becomes dwarfed by the sheer scope of a mountain peak or, the ocean or something, and really reveling in that. And it sort of speaks to this proclivity in the West and the Western spiritual traditions to really elevate peak experiences and really cling to them. And one thing I've always appreciated about Buddhism is that it, an experience in meditation of, say, a breakthrough, I mean, it's significant, or a really bright state, but, we're really instructed to not make too much of it and not to cling and to continue with putting in the causes. So I can see where the idea in, say, that secular Buddhist conference that wonder doesn't have a place in Buddhism. I understand perhaps a bit of what they're speaking to, although I'm sure they're speaking to something else as well. But I think what I was thinking about is that romantic experience of wonder is the experience of encountering something completely sort of outside of our knowledge and of our bounds of self, and something vast. And it, that whole idea of wonder emerging in the Romantic era, at that time, nature's being held up as this beautiful, romanticized thing. Whereas in the Buddha's time, nature had those qualities of magnificence, but it also was something very dangerous and something to be wary of. Which is why I think that when, the Buddha, when I think there is that encounter with the vastness of the world and of reality in the Buddhist canon, it isn't just a romantic experience of all positive emotion, but also a sense of urgency and um, danger is involved. And I think that's uh, where that really interesting word sangwega, which you mentioned as well, Ajahn, earlier before we started the conversation, comes in. And that samwega, well, actually, before I go on, Ajahn, do you want to try to speak to samwega or just translate it in? It may be a word that needs about 3 hours to translate. So, would you? Yeah.
Yeah, I knew a guy who had sung Vega. He was a Buddhist practitioner, but he was also a trucker. And on the back of his big truck, he had some Vega kind of stickered on the back. And he took it to the automotive shop. And the guy in the shop got really excited and says, "Sam Vega, my cousin's name is Sam Vega." So that's a different context. But in the Buddhist context, Samvega is translated as awe, A-W-E. It can be translated as a sense of astonishment or I think wonder. Do you remember how Ajahn Tanisra translates it?
He says it consists of three elements. There's a chastening over our own foolishness. There's a sense of, I think, urgency or something like that around like the need to do something, and also of something that echoes of awe. What you're saying, say the scope of the issue, it's almost most easily translated through the situations it arises in. But continue, Ajahn. I don't have a better translation.
Yeah. In the Pali Canon, especially in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, Digha Nikaya number 16, there are 4 Sangvejaniya Satana, which are basically the 4 holy sites of Buddhism, where the Buddha was born, where he was enlightened, where he passed away, and where he taught the Dhammacakka Sutta. And those are Tana, or places which give rise to this samvega, or this sense of wonder or awe, or even like this. Yeah. So, it's Ajahn Jeff makes a good point that samvega in Buddhism is paired with pasada. So pasada is the sense of confidence in the Buddha's enlightenment, and it doesn't just occur alone. So when you find the word wonder or wonderment or amazement in secular contexts or humanist contexts, which almost fetishize certain peak experiences, as you mentioned, in a Buddhist context, they're balanced and put into a context of the Dhamma. So you have these states of awe, but then you've got the response. So, yeah, samsara is vast, and there are dangers, or you can say there are these very vast mind states, but there's a duty. There's things how we can respond to that. It's not just a state which all we can do is just gawk at. So those are a few thoughts on Samvega.
I think I remembered the other term, Ajahn. Ajahn Tanisra says it's dismay, chastening, and urgency.
Wow, that's great.
Which are not terms we associate with awe, but I think what you're pointing to is correct. Like in Buddhism, as opposed to romantic thought, it's an experience of two things. The unknown is seen as dangerous, and I mean, one of the instances where samvega comes up in the suttas is when sort of high status aristocrat sees suddenly the entourage of dancing women that have been entertaining him lying, sleeping, and he perceives just them as so many sort of corpses, and is so alarmed by this illusion that he's been trapped and uh, fooled by, to an extent, in that he's been looking for happiness completely there, that he goes out and searches for the Buddha. And I'm having some light issues. So somehow for me, I like the metaphor of Plato's cave. It's almost as if what the Romantic poets are pointing to sometimes is, say, a glimpse of light, of the light outside of the cave, the sun, or something like that, like some just vague glimpse that makes its way through the stone, through a crack for a moment. Um, what I get the sense the Buddha is pointing to is there's a sense of disenchantment mixed in with there, and of danger, but also a sense of urgency and possibility, like the prisoner in the cave suddenly beginning to turn their head towards this light. And there's the simultaneous experience of perceiving the shadow on the wall and seeing that it's just a shadow, and also in one's periphery perceiving this intimation of light that one is turning towards. And for me, I just remember the moment when I really decided to pursue the spiritual path had both of those elements. There was a dismay at what I'd spent so many years trapped in, but there was also this exhilaration over the possibility of, and the scope and broad vistas of a spiritual path, which felt so right. So for me, Samvega is a much more complex, but also much more meaningful term than kind of this fluffy cotton candy term of wonder as it's used in, the European romanticists. What are your
Yeah, I
thoughts?
agree. In, say, the New Age or new religious movement context, which you find wonder kind of vaulted as this exalted state of almost like that's the nibbana, that's what you want, and you can get that just from seeing a sunset, and that's in some ways held up as good as it gets. That's as good as things get, and there isn't really this sense that we're describing with Samvega as this sense of that maybe there's more, and this is fleeting, and who knows how much more time we have to practice, and who knows what's going to happen next. So, yeah, the Buddhist context is more nuanced, more complicated.
Ajahn, sorry, I have a question for you, but finish. I don't want to interrupt you.
Oh no, that was just a note. Yeah, it's not easy to translate Samvega.
When in your life, I mean, maybe one useful way is, I'm curious, when in your life have you felt it the strongest? When was or one or two moments where Samvega really became a reality for you? Because I find I can't define it, but I remember very clearly the moments when it was there in my life. Or I can't define it in one word.
Yeah, maybe you can share first. Nothing is immediately jumping to mind, but I'm curious what your experiences are.
I mean, I think it manifested a few ways. There was the moment when I was 15 when I read Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, which is not a very Buddhist book in many ways, but I was pretty depressed at the time, and that vision of the Buddha and of monks burnt itself into me, and it was like seeing, yeah, the footstep that was made for me. And that's when I started meditating every day. And that was a very positive experience of Samvega. Like there was some disillusionment, but it was more this opening, like an intuition of golden light. And I think we're provided with those every now and again in a life. But then there was, then you forget. I mean, I kept meditating, but I sort of forgot about that and went to college and all that. And then I just remember after college driving down the Californian coast, and over the past few years, things had become more and more numb, and I sort of I felt so hungry for something, but I didn't know what. And I just remember, sorry, my light changed again. I just remember stepping into a Bayagiri after 2 days of listening to Top 40 radio and reading the new Hunger Games and like watching movies on my stops, and just feeling that silence there and knowing that I really being dismayed at how I'd managed to run from something in me for 2 or 3 or 10 years, and also knowing very clearly what I had to do if I was going to stop running, which was to take on robes. And um, that that moment was dismaying, but also it was the most hopeful I'd ever been in a different way, because it was the first time I'd really seen the path open up. So there was exhilaration there too.
Hmm. That's cool. It sounds like it's a mix of the samvega, or this chastening urgency and dismay, mixed with the pasada, or this clear confidence that there is a way. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
I think for myself, a similar experience was the first Goenka retreat that I did, a 10-day retreat. And for anyone who's done one of those, you'll know, I mean, it's just 10 days, 24 hours times 10, 240 hours. But um, it feels like months, or it feels like at least much longer than that. And I very clearly remember, feelings of intense dismay, followed by, hours and hours of practice, and then feelings of intense elation. And it's like all of this is going on in my mind, and it would just flip flop like this because I hadn't yet developed the skills to know how to have any kind of influence on these habits of mine. So I think by the end of that retreat, I was thoroughly chastened and got this idea that, okay, the mind can be trained. The mind can open up to these vast vistas, which really are, um, experiences of wonder. This is one other experimental translation that I'm thinking of, is piti
Mm,
as wonder. So piti for most people is, it from the 5 jhana factors, which are vitaka, vichara, piti, sukha, and ekagata, or directed thought, evaluation. Piti, which is normally translated as rapture or joy or gladness, and sukha, happiness and one-pointedness, ekagata. But I think piti could be translated as wonder, with certain implications of that word. So there were certainly times during that 10-day retreat when I'm just experiencing very settled states of mind, in which things are just so quiet and settled, and it's like I'm sitting on the top of a mountain looking out, 360 degrees, and just space all around, and a very profound experience. But it's totally internal. And I think that's a low grade level of PT. So that's just something I've been thinking about. What do you think about that? Is wonder being a possible translation for one aspect of PT?
yeah, I mean, for me, I suppose the like PT, that, yeah, I mean that's a hard one to translate as well. But I certainly think that the experiences our culture and in personal experience associate with wonder have that element of piti, of you know uh, exhilaration, of um,
Thrill.
thrill. Yeah, and for me, I suppose one way that I was thinking about this concept of awe was, there's the encounter with the unknown, which for the romantics was totally positive in a lot of ways. It was nature and you know something you wrote about, whereas in Buddhism it's positive and uh, dangerous because it's samsara, and positive in the sense of potential. But then there's also this element of awe, which is the opposite, which is coming into contact not with the unknown, but with something which is profoundly known in a deep level, and an intuition of pattern. And for me, what you spoke of earlier, Ajahn, with where this phrase comes up in the suttas, when the Buddha says how it's wonderful, marvelous, that one can see paticca samuppada, dependent origination, manifesting in the world, or when the Buddha speaks a profound teaching, and the one listening says, "Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it marvelous?" How just as one turns a pot that has been turned upside down upright, or uncovered something that's been covered, just so this discourse has made the Dhamma clear, which all speak to somehow not the unknown so much as the opposite, in terms of something profoundly deep and known. And I'm struck by, another way of thinking of awe or wonder is when, the hair on one's arms like lifts. And I've heard it noted that when one listens to a really good piece of music, that the intuition of patterns laying over each other sometimes initiates that physical response of things.
Hair raising.
And that it's gentler, but sometimes, for me, that's the beauty of when you gain an intuition of, sometimes you see something from meditation, or with a still mind, or listen to a teaching, and it hits so deep because it's something you've always known, or something makes sense in a way that your mind was ready for it, but suddenly it's laid out again. And I have that experience again and again with the Dhamma and with practice. And I think wonder sometimes feels a bit strong for that, but I think it's essentially the same thing. And I think maybe that aspect of encountering the known in the sense of a profound known is associated with piti, like you're saying, and also speaks to how it's referenced in the suttas. And also, I suppose it relates to samvega a little bit as well, because as soon as you see the scope of danger and folly, at the same time as you intuit something in us, I think, knows our spiritual potential and our path in some sense, or at least the direction. And so there's also a recognition. So yeah, for me, there's this two sides of wonder, of encountering the unknown and also perceiving a pattern which we do know at some deep level.
That's a good summary. Yeah, I think that hair-raisingness is certainly an aspect of piti, as it's described, and the word lomahangsa, I believe, like hair-raising, comes up in the sutta in the exact context that you're suggesting. So, should we go to a few questions?
Yeah, and I just want to namaste Khan Ayatataloka. It's amazing to see you on our live stream.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. Please, Ajahn.
So we have a question from La. So from both of your perspective, from living in Thailand and the USA temples, what could each culture learn from the other?
Ajahn, I want to hear your answer for that, if you feel up for it.
Yeah, good question. I've lived about 6 years of my monastic life in Thailand, and there's just so much that Americans who've never lived in a Buddhist culture could learn from going to live probably in any Buddhist culture, but I can just speak most specifically to my experience in Thailand. Yeah, it's so many aspects of mundane right view are just so deep. Yeah, they're deeply embedded in the blood of the culture. So you've got belief in the prominence of the importance of mother and father, the importance of generosity, the importance and existence of good and bad karma, belief in other realms. And these things just manifest in so many different ways that you just see and experience, especially living in a monastery in Thailand every day. I mean, going on alms is a profound, and honestly, that is a wonder-inducing experience. Certainly for myself, but I know my family who are not Buddhist, but when they came to visit me in Thailand and followed us on alms round, seeing people, very poor people, wake up at 6:30 in the morning to put sticky rice in our bowls, it's awe-inspiring. They, leave just uh, mouths agape, no no idea how to respond to that. It's a profound experience. So, just seeing that, living that, being the beneficiary of such generosity and such a supportive culture is certainly something which Americans new to Buddhism can learn from Thailand. And just humility, the beauty of humility. So many people in America are skeptical and suspicious about power dynamics. So you come to a monastery in America and you see people bowing to people, bowing to statues, and you're like, oh, this is just some cult. They're trying to play some power games. Go to Thailand, go to Sri Lanka, go to Burma, and see 70, 80-year-old people who've been bowing their whole lives, and it's the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. And that'll change your whole idea about power dynamics. So that's one perspective, what we can learn from Thailand. Maybe could you speak to the other dynamic, or also this direction as well?
Well, I also wanted to highlight what you're saying around generosity in Thailand being awe-inspiring, because you're right. I mean, that's the beauty, is that experience has been so constrained in Western language to, encountering a vast mountain peak or a vision in nature. But the vistas of the human heart that become visible through an act of selflessness and of generosity, and just the breadth of spirit that you get like a vision into with some of those simplest acts, like that is awe-inspiring in the same way, and humbling in the same way. And I just think that's a beautiful thing to point out, Ajahn. Like I was thinking, why is going on alms round awe-inspiring and bring up piti and piti, and maybe it's because in the simple hands of, a grandmother in Thailand bending and, you know putting a ball of sticky rice in your bowl, it's somehow a vision into like the majesty of the human spirit, but it's through the most simple thing you could imagine. And that's a really healthy, that's just such a beautiful way of thinking about it, that
Mm.
it's not this thing you have to go hike into nature. And I think, there's a lot to be said for how our culture romanticizes nature and values it, but I think sometimes we miss the beauty and divinity of just the people around us, and the simple act of, a mother folding her, uh, like, or, a child folding the laundry for his mother, something so
Mm.
simple. But you're right. Like, I've seen that all through Thai culture, and I don't think they call it the land of smiles for nothing. And yeah, that's a good point, Ajahn. Maybe it's related a bit to the Pali word for beauty, Kalyan. You would be able to speak more to Kalyani, but that almost seems like a term that speaks to it, but um, maybe echoes this idea of wonder in its most wholesome and humble sense a bit.
Yeah. Maybe in the opposite direction, maybe what people in Thailand who've just grown up with Buddhism, what they might be able to learn from, say, a Western context, might tie in with this next question. So it sounds like wonder is related to insight, according to the sources you cited. So one thing which I think is beneficial and was highlighted to me when I was in that secular Buddhist retreat 2 months ago is that there's really this almost like fearlessness of questioning tradition, questioning sources, and actually finding a positive and, to some extent, if it's held rightly, even a positive and wholesome sense of wonder in this investigation. So one other Pali word which might be catch some of the nuances of wonder is Dhammavichaya, or investigation of Dhamma, which is the second of the Bojjhangas, or the factors of awakening. It's basically an investigation of the Dhamma. So can we find wonder and awe and insight, as Caroline suggests? Yeah, can you just be Acharya Abhuta? It's amazing, it's wonderful how this Paticca Samuppada has been declared, how deep and profound the Buddha's Dhamma is, and just really marveling in the profundity of the teachings. So
I think that relates a bit, Ajahn, to the because you're right. Like, say, I remember, in terms of what the West has brought in terms of digging to the deepest strata or earliest strata of some of the texts. Say how the comparative studies of the Chinese agamas, the texts, and the Pali Canon show like there's a concord, that the pattern in the teachings becomes increasingly clear. And for me, that recognition is that moment of wonder that you're pointing to, arrived at through investigation. So, for example, I remember the fourth foundation of mindfulness, Satipatthana, frame of reference. You encounter it in the Pali Canon, and it's very broad. It involves looking at experience and through the lens of the five hindrances, which are these mental blocks to calm, the seven enlightenment factors, the six sense paces, the five aggregates, like these many different lenses. And it sort of is this amazing buffet, we'll say, but it's a lot. And I remember learning that comparative study had basically shown that the Buddha, for this fourth foundation, just taught it as the five hindrances, which are these sort of negative qualities in the mind, and the seven enlightenment factors, which are these positive qualities. And suddenly, this sort of somewhat foggy pattern or teaching became so clear and simple, and the pattern that was underneath and the sort of harmony of the teaching was reestablished or made clear again. And for me, yeah, that involved or initiated that experience of wonder that you're pointing to. So that investigation of early text seems to speak to that a bit. I think I'll keep talking because Ajahns disappeared. So, Shelley says that we have been such grateful recipients of your presence on Alms Round. It doesn't seem like generosity. Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, I think Shelley was at the Pacific Hermitage when we were on alms there, and it gave us many beautiful gifts. And I think actually what you're speaking to, Shelley, is important, because in terms of the majesty of the human spirit and of giving, and what that reveals about a human heart being manifest in the simplest things, my feeling around receiving alms is the same, is that in the sheer scope of generosity and the power of that act, the giver and the recipient dissolve in a certain way, and you just exist in a field of blessings, and both receive in some sense. So maybe it speaks to the profundity and the vastness of that experience of giving. And that's why I think it initiates awe and wonder. Ajahn, I think we've got him back.
Well, apologies for that. Are we ready for another?
Yes, please.
All right. We've got a note here from someone by the name of Shelley Baxter.
Oh, I
Good to
just
see you.
talked to that one, Ajahn, but you should also speak to it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, it's good to see people who appreciate seeing monastics on alms round, because we're definitely appreciative as well. It makes me think of the first time I saw a monastic. It was a Sri Lankan monk. When I was 20 years old, I had done my first 10-day retreat, and I was thinking that I might want to be a monk. And I saw this Sri Lankan monk about to get on a bus in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was just struck by this, oh my gosh, OMG, I've got to do something to help this monk. And I was just temporarily awed by him. So I can relate to that.
Ajahn, do you want to speak to the question which we had received via email earlier?
Yeah, good call.
Do you want to start, Ajahn?
Well, the question which we got about 2 months ago was just someone saying how over the course of a 2-week meditation retreat, they've noticed how their felt sense of the body changes. So their faces relax, the muscles throughout their body just seem to loosen up in different ways. And the question was, how do the bodies of monastics, specifically of us, how have we felt that the body has changed since we've ordained? So that's a summary of the question.
And there was the and also, was there sort of a follow-up with it, just so I can get my head around the whole thing, around how we've changed in general since ordaining? Was that part of it, or do you remember the exact phrasing?
I actually don't have it right here, but I think that first part, there's a lot there. Yeah, for myself, how has my body changed? I think just becoming more mindful of the body in general, how I relate to other people. When thinking about the body, we've got, maybe you could think of it in 4 different ways. You've got the kinesthetic sense, which is how the body moves. You've got the proprioceptive sense, which is how the body moves in relation to either objects outside or how limbs relate to one another. You've got the vestibular sense, which is basically how we keep balance. And then you've got the tactile system, which is basically our sense of touch just on the surface of our skin. And I think for myself, and I've heard other monastics, you just become more sensitive to all of these different body-based senses. So kaya potaba, the sense of touch, really encompasses those 4 different realms of the body. So you become more sensitive to those. As we have teachers like Lumpur Pasano, who just repeatedly emphasize that this can be one's main vehicle for practice, is just staying in the body. And by that, meaning keeping mindfulness within the scope of this fathom-long body. So, yeah, in terms of, do we look any different?
A little bit.
A little bit. Yeah. What do you think?
I think, I mean, the Buddhist practice is such an interesting paradox in its development of a relationship to the body, because on one level, there are these contemplations seeing through the body, asubha, not beautiful, and just sort of attenuating our attachment to the body. Sorry, low battery. I'm all right. And this is different than, I think, creating a negative body image in the Western sense, because that sort of negative body image is comparing one's body to other bodies, whereas one's body's bad and other bodies are good. But asubha practice, seeing the body just as a compilation of bones and flesh, etc., in Buddhism really lets you see all bodies as the same. These kind of awkward, kind of strange little creatures we, ride around in or whatever, or have a relationship to. And there's actually, it kind of lets people's spirits shine through much brighter when there's that distancing from that. But there's also tapping into the body as a resource in terms of the Anapanasati Sutta, mindfulness of breathing. And my sense is that when that's practiced skillfully and developed, that one gains access to these subtle energies, that are associated with the breath, pana, prana in Sanskrit. I think it could be associated with chi in Taoist thought. And there's enormous resources of well-being in that, and a means of brightening the mind and calming when one becomes skilled at that. And another interesting thing for me is that when one moves awareness into the heart again and reacquaints oneself with one's body, because as Ajahn Amaro says, so many of us Westerners just think of our necks as these things that keep our heads from dragging on the ground. We gain access to more than just this sort of shallow sense of this physical form, but it's almost like the intuitive sense, the thing that guides us clearly, resides in the heart. And I think if we're stuck in our heads, you don't have access to that sort of voice of Dhamma and that sort of gentle guide that can show us the pure path through any situation. So my sense is that there's this strange relationship in the body where on one level you're gaining a bit of distance from the physical aspect of it, but on another level you're acknowledging that it's a resource and the home of the heart, and of that voice, which has been my most trustworthy guide through my entire life. So it's not exactly the body, but it is somehow. Maybe it's the subtle body.
Do we have time for a few more questions? I've got one here. So where I live, many people proclaim their religious views are, quote, the one true religion. Does wonder include an openness to views, opinions, and beliefs? Are people more open-minded in Buddhist cultures?
Ajahn, go for it.
Well, yeah, it's hard to talk about cultures in general. But yeah, I mean, look at Thailand and Burma. In many ways, Thailand is a very open country. It's people call it the sex change capital of the world. And look at Burma, with a military dictatorship, which is reported to be very closed-minded with regards to other religions. But I think a very good case could be made that any government which is acting in a violent ways towards people is not certainly not acting from the teachings of the Buddha. There's no if, and, or but about the Buddha's prohibition of violence. But just in terms of how we stand and how we look at other religions, other cultures, others' beliefs, I think there's just more space in Buddhism, certainly in the minds of the mature practitioners that I've met. And I think just in my own outlook on other religions, does wonder play a role in how I think of other religions? Well, there's certainly a questioning. The Buddha allowed us to question things which should be questioned and encourage that. So, yeah, if I see an inspiring practitioner of some other religion, then I would genuinely be curious, which I think is an interesting facet of wonder, about what is it this person is doing that brings out the lightness in their practice, in their life, in how they present to the world. So this curiosity, I think, is definitely a healthy mind state, which we can bring to examining the world around us. And yeah, so I think that's my answer, my approach. What do you think?
Well, I think like looking at wonder, an experience of wonder in the recognition of pattern, like a deep pattern that we might have intuited but not seen, or recognizing a pattern somewhere. I think that plays into this a bit, in that when you see the same pattern played out across traditions, there is a sense of recognition, wonder, gratitude, and openness. And I think Buddhism is not completely unique, but certainly has unique qualities in that it points to a higher order patterning across spiritual tradition. So, for example, and for the record, I deeply respect many traditions, because I think Buddhism allows me to see, and the spiritual path allows one to see this patterning across traditions. But I guess what I'm saying is that if salvation's dependent on a certain word or name, and having faith in a certain 2 syllables or 3 syllables or something like that, and if someone doesn't ascribe completely to those syllables, then they're going to hell. That's one pattern towards salvation. But if the idea, say, of right concentration, in which one can take any word that's wholesome as an object of concentration, and that's a valid step upon the path. So that word could be Buddha, but it could also be Christ or God, in terms of bringing the mind to concentration, at least. For me, that's a high level patterning. And I think Buddhism really allows, the Buddha said that anyone practicing the Eightfold Noble Path is practicing rightly. And because I think many of those path factors allow quite a bit of space in how they're approached, that framework allows one to perceive a high order pattern across traditions, and to perceive the common threads, and not to equate every tradition with any other, and not in this conversation to elevate one tradition above the others, but just to say that one thing I'm grateful for in the Buddhist teaching is the breadth of patterning it allows one to see across traditions and cultures. And so I think there is a good deal of tolerance in that. The Buddha certainly never made any allowance for violence against another religion. And so for me, there is a great acknowledgement there of, a certain validity, at least in different aspects of the path practiced across traditions. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Ajahn.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And just to make it clear, I'm a Buddhist. I'm happy saying that. And I want to be a monk for the rest of my life. And the Buddhist teachings are great. But I think you make some great points. There's a wonderful book called The Way of the Pilgrim, written by an anonymous Russian Orthodox monk in the 1700s. And for some of the best, most explicit wonder writing that certainly I've ever seen, it's basically him living extremely simply, just eating the most simple fare, wandering around from place to place, and just experiencing wonder and awe in basically, it seems like a jhanic state. He's kind of stumbled into or brought himself into a pretty profound state of absorption. So I think, yeah, what he's done with that, was he able to take that absorption state and turn it towards enlightenment? Unsure, but he was definitely very absorbed and very concentrated. So we've about read it
I was actually
out of
sorry,
time.
Ajahn.
Please.
Oh, just I remember being at a Bayagiri and looking through the archives of MP3s and stumbling across a Way of the Pilgrim that had been reworded into Buddhist context, which I thought was pretty brilliant.
That's right.
By a certain very well-meaning monk and very inspiring monk. So it's
That's right. I took that.
I thought that was pretty great, Ajahn.
Yeah. I basically read the first several chapters of that book, recording myself and changing all the words God or Lord Jesus Christ have mercy on me, and changing them to Buddha and the Buddha, etc. And it worked for me. So
it was a good recognition of pattern. And Ajahn, my phone is about to die.
all right. Well, let's bring it to a close. Thank you, everybody, for writing in, and it's great to feel that we're building this community. So, you want any closing comments, Venerable?
Yeah, if anyone's in Seattle, I've arrived, so I think we're having our first gathering at Lincoln Park in West Seattle on Saturday morning. I'll be going for alms at Pike Place every weekday, starting Wednesday. Ajahn Kovilo is going to be coming for a visit early August, so game on. It'll be really lovely to see. Anyways, it'll be lovely to see everyone and to step into this community, and we're just glad to actually be meeting everyone in person. And if one wants any details of any of those events, you can go to our website, clearmountainmonastery.org. And the newsletter's there, as is the alms round page, as is soon will be the date of Ajahn's visit to Seattle. So we appreciate this online community, but it'll be really nice to sort of form a community in person soon enough, and looking forward to having these discussions in person, Ajahn.
Me too. All right. Have a good night, Venerable. Have a good night, everyone tuning in, and hopefully see you later.